Imagine a man who loves humanity so completely, so ferociously, that he spends 3,500 years destroying everything humanity has ever built. Imagine a ruler so wise that his wisdom looks indistinguishable from tyranny. Imagine a god who fashions himself into a monster precisely so that his people will one day find the courage to kill him. This is not a paradox invented for dramatic effect. This is the central logic of Leto Atreides II, the God Emperor of Dune. And once you understand it, truly understand it, nothing in the history of science fiction literature will ever feel quite the same again. Leto II does not merely rule for millennia. He calculates. He suffers. He watches generation after generation of human beings born into a world he has deliberately made smaller, more fearful, more humiliating, and more suffocating. He watches children grow up under the shadow of his fish speakers, under the weight of his laws, under the slow asphyxiation of a peace so total it functions like a burial. And he does this knowing full well what he is doing. He does it because he has looked down every corridor of possible futures, and he has found that every path which does not pass through this particular darkness ends in extinction. Not the death of an empire, the death of the species. The question that haunts every serious reader of Frank Herbert's 6 Dune novels is the same question Leto himself wrestles with across the 4,000 pages of the saga. What kind of love is it that murders everything it claims to protect in order to save it? What kind of vision looks at the glittering machinery of a 10,000-year civilization and sees not achievement, but a trap? And what does it mean for the rest of us, sitting in our own comfortable certainties that Leto might have been right? That is the question this narration will answer. Not quickly and not cleanly, because the answer is not a clean thing. It reaches into ecology and psychology, into the philosophy of time and the biology of freedom, into Herbert's own deep anxieties about charisma and power and the terrible seduction of being saved by someone else. We begin where Leto himself always said, we must begin not with the God Emperor, but with the world he inherited. Let us begin with the trap itself. The Padishah emperors of House Carino ruled the known universe for roughly 10,000 years before Paul Atreides dismantled their throne. 10,000 years is a number so large it becomes abstract, but it is worth sitting with its weight for a moment. 10,000 years ago from our present, human civilization was in its earliest agricultural infancy. The wheel had barely been invented. Writing did not yet exist. And yet the Carino Imperium endured for that entire span of time, give or take a few centuries of chaos at the edges, without fundamental structural change. It did not evolve. It did not transform. It persisted. Most readers of the first Dune novel encounter this as background texture, a sign of how old and deeply entrenched the universe is. But Herbert intended it as horror, not the horror of violence or suffering, though those are present in abundance, but the quieter, more insidious horror of a civilization that has forgotten how to become anything other than what it already is. The Carino Imperium did not survive 10,000 years because it was strong. It survived because it had constructed, piece by piece, an invisible architecture of dependency so total that the human species had become, in a very real sense, domesticated. Consider the 3 great pillars upon which the Old Imperium rested, because understanding them is essential to understanding why Leto believed they had to be broken. The first pillar was the Spacing Guild. The guild held an absolute monopoly on interstellar travel. Their navigators, mutated by generations of spice consumption into something barely recognizable as human, could fold space and guide ships safely between the stars. Without them, there was no commerce, no communication across the vast distances of known space, no empire. Everything moved through guild hayliners, and everything that moved through guild hayliners could be tracked, taxed, controlled, or denied passage. The guild was not merely a transportation company. It was the circulatory system of human civilization. And the heart of that system required a constant supply of melange, the spice of Arrakis. The second pillar was CHOAM, the Combine Hanete Ober Advancer mercantiles, which functioned as the economic bloodstream flowing through that circulatory system. CHOAM held shares in every significant commercial enterprise in the Imperium. The great houses, the Emperor, the Guild, the Bene Gesserit, all of them held CHOAM stock, and all of them were therefore bound together in a web of financial interdependency that made open warfare perpetually ruinous and compromise perpetually preferable. CHOAM was not a government. It was the invisible reason why governments behaved the way they did. The third pillar was the spice itself. Melange extended life. It enabled prescient navigation. It gave the Bene Gesserit their heightened perception and the Mentats their computational abilities. It was produced in one location in the entire universe, the sands of Arrakis. Whoever controlled Arrakis controlled the future, which is why the great houses fought so viciously for its stewardship and why the Corino emperors kept Arrakis close. Spice was not merely a commodity. It was the nervous system of civilization. Together, these three pillars created what we might call the safe universe. This is a term Leto himself uses, though scholars of Herbert's work have elaborated it significantly. The safe universe is the condition of a civilization that has optimized so thoroughly for stability, for legibility, for predictability, that it has eliminated the very randomness and friction which drive adaptation. It is a universe where every inhabited planet is known, mapped, and reachable by anyone who pays the guild's fees. A universe where every great house can be located and destroyed if it steps too far out of line. A universe where the biological and economic levers necessary to control human behavior are concentrated in so few hands that control itself becomes relatively simple. Herbert was drawing here on a set of ideas he encountered in ecology and systems theory. A monoculture, however lush and productive it appears in the short term, is catastrophically vulnerable to any disruption it has not already encountered. A field of genetically identical wheat produces spectacular harvests until the right pathogen arrives, and then it produces nothing at all. The Corino Imperium was a monoculture of civilization. Its very success had eliminated the diversity of human social organization, the competing models of governance and economy and culture that might have allowed humanity to survive any shock it had not already learned to absorb. The peace of the Imperium was not merely comfortable. It was, in Herbert's view, a slow elimination of the species' immune system. Leto saw this in a way no one else could, because Leto could see time. His prescience, amplified far beyond what his father Paul had possessed, allowed him to survey the vast branching tree of possible futures. And what he saw, again and again, along every path that preserved the existing structure of the Imperium, was the same thing. A long, dark extinction. Not necessarily soon, not necessarily dramatic, but inevitable. Because a species that has stopped choosing its future has already, in the deepest sense, surrendered it. Herbert was also thinking about something more subtle here, something he called prescient stagnation, though the phrases are gloss on his ideas rather than a direct quotation from the novels. When enough people can see the future, or believe they can, the future loses its character as open possibility and becomes instead a series of corridors, some acceptable and some forbidden. The Bene Gesserit's breeding program is one example. 10,000 years of careful genetic selection aimed at producing a specific individual, the Kwisatz Haderach, who could access the deepest levels of ancestral memory and prescient vision. The Guild's navigators are another, beings who have traded their humanity for the ability to fold space along known, safe paths. Even the Mentats, human computers trained to extrapolate probabilities with mathematical precision, are expressions of this tendency, the substitution of calculated certainty for genuine choice. A civilization organized around the prediction and management of the future is a civilization that has, in a very real sense, chosen to stop having one. It has traded the dangerous, generative uncertainty of genuine becoming for the safety of an already written script. Leto understood that this was not merely a political problem or an economic problem. It was a problem at the level of what human beings are. And the only cure he could see was catastrophically expensive. Now, let us think carefully about the cure, because it is easily misunderstood, And misunderstanding it leads people to dismiss Leto as a megalomaniac when he is, in Herbert's framework, something far more unsettling than that. Leto Atreides II chooses, at an age we might call early adolescence, to begin fusing his body with the sand trout, the pre-larval stage of the great sandworms of Arrakis. This is not a process with a comfortable middle ground. Once begun, it cannot be reversed. The sand trout cover his skin, altering his biochemistry, vastly extending his lifespan, and gradually transforming him into something that is neither fully human nor fully sandworm. He will live in this hybrid state for 3,500 years. He will become, over those centuries, physically enormous, nearly unkillable, and possessed of a prescient vision that dwarfs anything else in the known universe. He will also slowly lose the ability to experience human touch, human intimacy, human ordinary life in any of its forms. It is worth being precise about why Leto makes this choice, because Herbert is precise about it. Leto does not become the God Emperor because he wants to rule. He becomes the God Emperor because he has surveyed every alternative and found them all wanting. He has seen what happened when his father Paul attempted a more humane version of the same task. Paul, who tried to redirect the jihad, to moderate it, to minimize the damage, and found that moderation in the face of systemic catastrophe is simply a slower path to the same end. Paul eventually walked into the desert and abdicated rather than continue. His twin children, Leto and Ghanima, were left to reckon with the consequences. Leto's solution is grounded in a principle that sounds almost clinical when stated plainly, but is in practice an act of extraordinary violence. If you need to force a species to evolve, you must create conditions so intolerable, so psychologically shattering, that the evolved response becomes a biological and cultural imperative rather than merely a preference. The peace of Leto, as scholars have come to call it, is the mechanism of this forcing. 3,500 years of enforced stability, centralized authority, and personal submission to the will of a single being, designed not to make obedience comfortable, but to make it so unbearable that every human being born under the God Emperor's rule carries, at some cellular level, the revulsion necessary to never allow this to happen again. This is not punishment. This is inoculation. The distinction is everything. The fish speakers, Leto's all-female military force, are perhaps the most elegant expression of this logic. In the Old Imperium, military power was distributed among the great houses and the Sardaukar, the emperor's terrifying shock troops. Power was, therefore, at least nominally competitive. Multiple entities held the means of violence, which meant that no single entity could ever be fully comfortable in its dominance. Leto replaces this with something far worse from the perspective of future health. A military cult built entirely on devotion to himself. The fish speakers are not soldiers in any conventional sense. They are worshippers with weapons. Their entire identity, their entire emotional and psychological structure is organized around the God Emperor. This is, deliberately, the most extreme possible expression of the charismatic leader trap that Herbert spent his entire career warning against. And it is deliberately designed to collapse. Because when Leto dies, and he arranges his own death carefully, the fish speakers will have no referent for their identity, no external source of meaning, no institutional structure that exists independently of the figure they worshipped. They will scatter, they will fail, and in their failure, every society that observed them, every human being who lived under their authority, will carry the lesson not as an abstract political principle, but as a visceral, felt truth. This is what happens when you surrender your conscience to a charismatic authority. This is what the worship of power looks like when the power dies. Moneo Atreides, Leto's chief majordomo and a distant descendant of the Atreides line, represents one face of this inoculation. Moneo is a man who has made his peace with the God Emperor's rule. He is not a fool. He understands intellectually what Leto is doing. But his acceptance is a kind of death in itself. The acceptance of a person who has surrendered the possibility of genuine resistance because resistance seems futile. Moneo is the cautionary half of the equation. Siona Atreides, his daughter, is the hopeful half. Siona is a rebel, a thief, a woman of genuine rage and genuine courage. And she is something else. She is the product of Leto's secret breeding program, the heir to a genetic modification that will prove, in the long architecture of the Golden Path, to be its most important gift to the species. But we will come to Siona in full when the time is right. Herbert was explicit in interviews and in his correspondence that Leto was meant to be the ultimate cautionary tale about charismatic leaders and godhead pushed to its logical extreme. He had been disturbed throughout his adult life by the human tendency to seek salvation in singular figures, to invest in one person or one ideology, the full weight of collective hope, and to surrender critical judgment in exchange for the comfort of certainty. He had watched this pattern destroy movements and nations and individuals. In Leto, he created a figure who embodies this tendency so completely and who understands so clearly what it costs that the reader is left with nowhere comfortable to stand. You cannot fully condemn Leto without acknowledging what he was trying to prevent. You cannot fully endorse him without acknowledging what he became. That tension is the point. Herbert wanted his readers uncomfortable because comfort, as we've already established, is the beginning of the trap. Having understood both the trap and the nature of Leto's response, we can now turn to the specific mechanics of destruction. Because the Golden Path was not merely a philosophical project, it was an institutional demolition program of extraordinary scope and precision. The Spacing Guild was Leto's first and most powerful lever. In the years following Paul Muad'Dib's jihad, the Guild held an extraordinary amount of leverage over even the most powerful rulers. Without their navigators, no army could move. No supply chain could function. No communication could cross the void between stars. Leto neutralized this leverage through an act of simple, devastating control. He held the spice. All of it. Arrakis, under Leto's rule, was a world so thoroughly under his personal authority that the yield of melange was determined entirely by his will. He could starve the guild into compliance or reward their cooperation. And he used this power with the patient precision of someone who understands that the most durable form of control is not force, but dependency. Over the centuries of his reign, the guild became something it had never been under the Carino emperors, a subordinate. Not a destroyed institution, not yet, but a diminished one. Their navigators grew more dependent, their commercial power contracted, their political leverage evaporated. And crucially, their monopoly on safe interstellar travel, the single fact that had made the Old Imperium's architecture possible, became increasingly contingent on Leto's goodwill rather than their own indispensable function. This matters because of what it teaches. When the Guild's monopoly finally dissolves, in the centuries after Leto's death and the beginning of the Scattering, it does not dissolve because someone invented a better navigational technology, though eventually they do. It dissolves because the psychological certainty that the Guild was irreplaceable has been eroded by 3,500 years of watching them serve at the pleasure of a single being. Humanity learns, slowly and painfully, that what seemed like a permanent structural feature of civilization was always a contingent arrangement maintained by power and habit. CHOAM presents a different kind of problem. You cannot simply starve CHOAM the way you can starve the Guild. Economic systems are more diffuse, more resilient, more capable of reinventing themselves through informal channels when formal ones are blocked. But you can make them irrelevant. Under Leto's rule, the economy of the Imperium gradually shifts in ways that are difficult to perceive in any single generation, but unmistakable across centuries. Planetary self-sufficiency, long suppressed by the efficiencies of interstellar trade and the political incentives to keep planets dependent on each other, begins slowly to re-emerge as Leto restricts trade flows and forces local economies to solve their own problems. This is deliberate policy, dressed as administrative neglect. The lesson, again, is pedagogical. Humanity had forgotten that worlds could feed themselves, that communities could organize themselves, that civilization did not require a galaxy-spanning administrative apparatus to function at a basic level. Leto was not merely weakening CHOAM. He was relearning a species how to be self-sufficient, one generation at a time, through the accumulated pressure of constraint. The Bene Gesserit are perhaps the most complex piece of this institutional demolition. The Sisterhood had been running their genetic breeding program for approximately the same 10,000 years the Carino emperors had been ruling. Their goal had been the production of the Kwisatz Haderach, a being who could access the deepest corridors of ancestral memory, both male and female, and whose prescient capabilities would exceed anything previously seen. They intended to control this being, to use him as a tool in their own project of quiet civilizational guidance. Paul was their Kwisatz Haderach, brought one generation early and therefore out of their control. Leto surpassed Paul. But what Leto did to the Bene Gesserit was not simply to exceed their project. He subverted it. He used his own knowledge of their breeding records, his access to the ancestral memories of every human being who had ever lived, to run a parallel breeding program within his own household. The goal of this program was not the production of enhanced prescience. It was the production of its negation. He was breeding across centuries for the Siona gene, a genetic configuration that made its bearer completely invisible to prescient vision. Think carefully about what this means for the Bene Gesserit. Their entire program was premised on the assumption that the future could be seen, guided, and managed by sufficiently advanced perception. Their reverend mothers, their truthsayers, their careful genealogical records, all of it was an institutional expression of the belief that the universe could be known in advance. That civilization could be steered by those wise and perceptive enough to read its currents. Leto's breeding program was an act of philosophical war against that belief, carried out in secret over millennia, while the Bene Gesserit continued their own work in the sincere belief that they were pursuing a coherent agenda. Herbert called this the terrible purpose, and while the phrase in the novels applies most directly to Paul's experience of his own destiny, it has a broader resonance in the context of these institutional destructions. Any sufficiently powerful centralized system, Herbert believed, will eventually optimize for its own perpetuation over the welfare of the beings it was meant to serve. The Guild was not evil. CHOAM was not evil. The Bene Gesserit were not evil, at least not simply. They were institutions that had become so successful, so deeply embedded in the structure of civilization, that they had transcended their original purposes and become purposes in themselves. The Guild did not exist to help humanity travel between stars. It existed to perpetuate the Guild. CHOAM did not exist to facilitate trade. It existed to perpetuate CHOAM. The Bene Gesserit did not exist to guide human genetic development. They existed to perpetuate the Bene Gesserit. This is not a cynical observation. It is an almost inevitable consequence of institutional success over long timescales. And it is why, in Leto's analysis, these destructions had to be simultaneous and slow rather than swift and sequential. A fast destruction of any one institution would have allowed the others to fill the vacuum and reconstitute the same dependency structures under new names. Only the slow, grinding, multi-generational dissolution of all of them together, accompanied by the equally slow cultivation of new human capacities for self-sufficiency and self-determination, could prevent the simple replacement of old traps with new ones. 3,500 years is, when you consider the scale of the problem, not excessive. It is barely sufficient. And now we come to the deepest level of the golden path, the part that Herbert kept almost hidden in the text of God Emperor of Dune, visible only to readers who were already asking the right questions. We come to the problem of prescience itself. It is easy to assume that prescience is simply power. The ability to see the future is obviously an advantage, and whoever possesses it most fully has the greatest ability to shape events in their favor. This is how the Bene Gesserit understood it. It is how the Guild understood it. It is, in a certain sense, how Paul understood it, at least initially. But Leto understood something about prescience that the others did not. The ability to see the future is not an advantage. It is a cage. He called it the Oracle's trap, and the logic is worth working through carefully. If you can see the future, you are seeing a specific set of outcomes flowing from a specific configuration of present conditions. Your vision is not neutral. It is shaped by your own perspective, your own desires, your own fears. And once you have seen a future, you are motivated to act in ways that either realize or prevent it, which means that your actions are now constrained by your vision. The future you see becomes a groove in which your choices run. You may feel free. You are not. Now extend this across an entire civilization. When the Spacing Guild's navigators are folding space, they are navigating along paths they have confirmed are safe using prescient vision. But safe for whom? And at what temporal resolution? The very concept of a safe path in space implies that all the unsafe paths are being excluded, that the space of possible routes is being filtered by a vision of consequences that has its own structure, its own biases. The Guild is not merely transporting cargo. It is continually pruning the tree of human possibility without anyone ever quite noticing or deciding that this is what should happen. The Bene Gesserit's breeding program is the same dynamic at the genetic level. They're selecting for specific traits across generations, eliminating genetic lines they consider unproductive, cultivating lines they consider valuable. This is prescient management of the human genome, and it means that the genetic future of humanity is not the result of genuine evolutionary selection of the random, frictional, unpredictable process that actually creates adaptive complexity. It is the result of what a council of extremely intelligent women in a particular historical moment decided was worth preserving. Leto, alone among all the prescient beings in the universe, understood that this was not a problem with solutions. It was a feature of prescience itself, inseparable from the capability. The only cure was to render the future genuinely unseeable. This is what the Siona gene does. Leto Atreides, the woman who ultimately participates in Leto's assassination, carries a genetic configuration that makes her completely invisible to any prescient gaze. A Bene Gesserit Reverend Mother looking into the future cannot see Siona. Leto himself, whose prescience spans millennia, cannot see anyone who carries the Siona gene in that same future. These people exist outside the corridors of predictable time. They are genuinely free in a sense that no previous human being had been since Prescience first appeared. The implications are staggering, and Herbert was drawing on sources beyond the Dune universe to develop them. His interest in Carl Jung's psychology and his reading of Norbert Wiener's foundational work on cybernetics both fed into this concept. Wiener had argued, in the years following the Second World War, that any system capable of perfect prediction would eventually generate its own pathologies. The information required to predict the system would become indistinguishable from the means of controlling it, and control would inevitably distort the system it was controlling. Herbert read this as a principle that applied not just to mechanical systems or economies, but to biological and civilizational ones as well. A species that can be predicted can be managed. A species that can be managed will be managed by whoever has the predictive capability. And once that management is thorough enough, the species is no longer genuinely alive in any evolutionary sense. It is a collection of specimens in a zoo that does not know it has walls. The Siona gene is Herbert's solution to Wiener's problem, expressed in biological terms. It does not give its bearers special powers. It does not make them stronger or wiser or more capable in any conventional sense. It simply makes them opaque. They exist in a genuine present rather than a predicted future. Their choices are their own in a way that no amount of education or courage or philosophical sophistication can achieve for those who remain visible to prescient eyes. And here is where the destruction of the Old Imperium becomes not merely a political or economic project, but a metaphysical one. Leto was not simply dismantling a set of institutions. He was dismantling a mode of existence. He was ending the era in which human beings were at the deepest level knowable to a sufficiently advanced perceiver. He was breaking the Oracle's trap not by destroying the Oracles, which he could have done, but which would only have meant that other Oracles arose to replace them, but by creating human beings for whom the Oracle's gaze finds nothing to rest upon. This required 3,500 years because the breeding program required time. The Siona gene had to be concentrated and stabilized across enough generations that it would spread reliably into the human population after Leto's death. It had to be invisible enough to the Bene Gesserit that they would not recognize it and work to eliminate it. And Leto himself had to live long enough to ensure that the gene was sufficiently distributed before the scattering began. Everything else, the institutional demolitions, the fish speakers, the peace, all of it was supporting architecture for this single biological achievement. Which is why Siona's role in Leto's assassination is not betrayal, it is graduation. Leto had bred and trained and tested her specifically to be the person who would end him. He needed his death to come from someone the future could not see, precisely to confirm that the breeding had worked. His death at Siona's hands was the proof of concept for everything the Golden Path had been designed to achieve. And now, at last, we reach the end of Leto's story and the beginning of everyone else's. Leto II dies in the 35th century of his reign, on a bridge over the Idaho River of Arrakis, pulled into the water and drowned by a coordinated effort that includes Leto Atreides, a Gola of Duncan, Idaho, and forces Leto himself had carefully arranged to be in the right place at the right time. His body, dissolving in the water, releases a vast number of sand trout into the environment, beginning the process of Arrakis' transformation back into desert. His death is both an ending and a seeding. What follows is what scholars and characters within the later novels call the scattering, and it is the single most consequential event in human history within the Dune universe, after the first discovery of spice. The scattering is not a planned migration or an organized exodus. It is an explosion. Without Leto's controlling hand, without the peace, without the institutional structures he had spent millennia carefully weakening, human civilization does not rebuild itself in an orderly fashion. It flies apart. Millions of ships, some with guidance and resources, many without, pour outward into uncharted space. People flee the old known universe in every direction, following rumors of habitable worlds, following religious impulses, following nothing more than the simple desire to be somewhere that Leto's shadow had never fallen. To understand how different this is from the Old Imperium, you have to hold the two images in your mind simultaneously. The old universe was, above everything else, comprehensible. Its boundaries were known. Its planets were cataloged. Its populations were registered in CHOAM's ledgers and tracked by the guild's shipping manifests and assessed by the Bene Gesserit's genealogical records. If you were a power capable of surveying the whole of human civilization, you could, in principle, locate any individual, any community, any resource. You could plan against them. You could harvest them. The new universe is the negation of all of this. Within a few generations of the scattering, human civilization exists in spaces no map has ever reached, on worlds whose names are unknown to any central authority, in communities that have developed their own languages and customs and technologies in isolation from everything that came before. The species has become too large, too dispersed, too radically varied to be either governed or destroyed by any single power. This is not the utopia Herbert's more optimistic readers might have wished for. It is something harder, stranger, and more enduring than utopia. The honored Matres, who appear in Heretics of Dune and Chapter House, Dune as the primary antagonists of the later saga, are the most honest testimony to what the scattering actually produced. They are women who came out of the far reaches of uncharted space, shaped by violence and trauma and the brutal politics of frontier survival, into something that even the Bene Gesserit find difficult to fully comprehend. They are addicted to the power of sexual and physical domination. They use a weaponized form of the Bene Gesserit's own training to bind men to them in dependency. They have abandoned almost everything the old sisterhood stood for in favor of a simple, brutal will to control, and they are terrifyingly effective. Herbert did not create the honored Matres as an argument against the scattering. He created them as an honest acknowledgement of what genuine freedom costs. When you release a species into an infinite frontier without central guidance, without the protective structures of an established civilization, you do not automatically produce enlightened communities of self-actualized individuals. You produce the full range of human possibility, which includes nightmare as well as dream. Some of the scattered humanity becomes something magnificent. Some of it becomes the honored Matres. Both outcomes are the price of genuine freedom. And Herbert believed, and Leto believed, that this price was worth paying because the alternative was the kind of safety that kills. Miles Tegg, the Bene Gesserit's most accomplished military commander in the era of heretics, is perhaps the best argument for the Golden Path's success. He is a product of the new universe, a man of extraordinary capability, operating in a genuinely complex political landscape where no single faction controls the board, where every institution must negotiate with every other, where the art of genuine statecraft has been relearned because there is no longer any option of simply submitting to the God Emperor's will. Tegg is not a saint. He is a warrior, and the things he does in service of the Bene Gesserit are not all admirable. But he is unmistakably free in a way that no figure in the Old Imperium, with the partial exception of Leto himself, could ever have been. He makes choices that could not have been predicted. He surprises even those who know him best. He is, in the vocabulary of the Golden Path, precisely what Leto died to make possible. The Bene Gesserit themselves, the Tleilaxu with their axolotl tanks and their face dancers, the remnants of the guild struggling to adapt without their spice monopoly, all of these factions in the later novels represent what Herbert meant by a genuinely complex civilization. One that cannot be dominated because it cannot be comprehended from any single vantage point. The universe of heretics of Dune and Chapter House. Dune is a universe of genuine political ecology, with competing entities, competing values, competing evolutionary trajectories, none of them capable of permanent dominance. All of them locked in a productive, dangerous, generative struggle that looks nothing like the ossified stability of the Old Imperium. Herbert never promised that this would be comfortable. He never suggested that the post-scattering universe was a good place to live, if goodness is measured in security and predictability and the absence of suffering. It is, by most ordinary measures, a worse place than the Old Imperium, at least in the short term. People die in greater numbers, in more varied ways. Communities fail and are destroyed without anyone to rescue them. The face dancers can replace anyone, and the threat of identity annihilation haunts the later novels in a way that the older universe never had to contend with. The universe after Leto is harder, stranger, and more frightening than the one before him. But it is alive. That is the word Herbert kept returning to in the novels and in his own reflections on the series. The post-scattering universe is alive in a way the Carino Imperium was not. It is capable of surprise. It is capable of genuine novelty. It cannot be predicted, cannot be harvested, cannot be brought to an end by any external threat because it has no single center to strike. It is the opposite of the safe universe, and that opposition is the whole point. Return then to the paradox with which we began. A man who loved humanity destroyed everything humanity had built, and in doing so, gave humanity the only gift that actually matters, the genuine possibility of a future that has not already been decided. Leto II understood more completely than anyone before or since within the world Herbert built, that safety is not survival, that stability is not health, that a civilization organized around the avoidance of catastrophe is a civilization that has already accepted a catastrophe so slow and so total that it never generates the alarm necessary to address it. He saw from inside the oracle's trap what the trap was made of, and he chose to spring it from within at the cost of everything he was. He made himself a monster, yes. 3,500 years of absolute authority, of an unkillable hybrid body, of a peace so suffocating that generations of human beings grew up never having known what genuine freedom felt like. This is monstrous by any ordinary standard of judgment. Herbert never asked us to deny this. He asked us to sit with the possibility that the monstrousness was the method, that the alternative was something quieter and more final, and that Leto chose the monstrous path with full knowledge of what it would cost not only the species, but himself. There's a passage late in God Emperor of Dune where Leto reflects that he has become everything he was warned against, that he has made himself the very thing his father Paul refused to be, and that this refusal of his father's was Paul's single greatest failure. It is a passage that resists simple paraphrase, because its weight comes from the accumulation of everything that precedes it in the novel, every conversation with his fish speakers and his monio, and the succession of Duncan Idaho Golas who have been his only real companions across the centuries. By the time Leto says it, the reader has been living inside his isolation long enough to feel it as something more than rhetoric. You understand in that moment that Leto is not defending himself. He is mourning himself. He is grieving the person he could not afford to be in service of a species that will never fully know what was sacrificed on its behalf. That grief is, in the end, what Herbert wanted us to carry away from the God Emperor's story. Not admiration, not condemnation, but the kind of moral seriousness that refuses easy categories. The Golden Path was not a triumph. It was a necessity, chosen in full awareness of its costs, executed over millennia with a discipline that no human being without Leto's particular gifts could have sustained, and completed at the cost of everything Leto might have been had he been born into a universe that did not require him. He destroyed the Old Imperium because it was a cage, and because the beings inside it had forgotten they were caged, and because the only way to open a cage that large and that old was from inside it, over centuries, by someone willing to be both the lock and the key. The scattering began. The future became genuinely unknowable. Humanity stepped out into the infinite dark, carrying in its blood the gift of opacity that 3,500 years of calculated tyranny had purchased. Whether it was worth the price, Herbert never quite answered. He left that question open in the silence after the last page, for each reader to carry alone into whatever future they are capable of seeing.